From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan along with David Feldman and, of course, the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. We have another very provocative show for you today. We're going to be talking to the Consumer Federation of America's J. Robert Hunter about how you might be getting ripped off on your car insurance, shocking as that may seem. That's for later in the show, but first we're going to talk about a topic that we've touched on a number of times with Ralph, and that is private contractors and the military. And today we have an absolute expert, someone who has literally written a book on the topic. So David, tell us about our first guest.
Our guest is Allison Stanger. She is the professor of international politics and economics at Middlebury College. Her most recent book is One Nation Under Contract, The Outsourcing of American Power and the Future of Foreign Policy. Professor Stanger has published numerous op-eds and testified before various congressional committees on this topic, and we are delighted to have her with us in studio. Professor Stanger, welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
And welcome from me, Professor Stanger. It just so happens that today, as we're taping the show, there is a conference at the American University Washington College of Law on the legal, policy, and ethical implications of the growing reliance upon military contractors. And this is an amazing panel because it's people from the establishment. It's people who worked in the Pentagon. And the keynote is by Chief Judge James E. Baker of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces. Now, you've come out with this book, One Nation Under Contract, and increasingly, it is an understatement. Underneath all are contracts. It's amazing. When you read the newspapers, you hear about consumer abuses and environmental violations and contract violations. Very few people talk about the contract. They talk about the violations, the cost overruns, the waste, the corruption. And yet, all this is permitted by the contract. It is facilitated by the contract, which is usually one-sided. And in your research, you make 3 points, at least, and this will set the stage for the discussion. One is, quote, the outsourcing of U.S. government activities is far greater than most people realize, has been very poorly managed, and has inadvertently militarized American foreign policy. And before we get to the other two, that really frames the issue. Can you fill in the blanks here and see how wide it is in terms of the taxpayers of this country?
Absolutely. Well, my book, One Nation Under Contract, really told the story of how American foreign policy was privatized across the so-called 3Ds of defense, diplomacy, and development. I also look at Homeland Security in that book. And what you see is this slow, gradual process of government becoming wholly dependent on contractors to do its daily work. And this has a number of important implications in the national security realm. You have our first two contractors' wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where contractors outnumbered American men and women in uniform on the ground in both those conflicts for a large portion of them. Just as a point of comparison, in the Vietnam War, at the height of our involvement, only 14% of the American presence on the ground was contractors. Today in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's over 50%, and that obviously changes the character of war in all sorts of ways. We know about the waste, fraud, and abuse. We can talk about that. It's endemic to wartime contracting for all sorts of reasons. But I think what contractors' war also does is allow us to overextend ourselves in new ways, because it's just so much easier to use military force. If we wanted to fight these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan 30 years ago, we would have had to have a draft to do so. But contractors plug that gap, and it's a way of keeping the American people disengaged from the sacrifices that war usually requires.
Give some examples.
Give some examples of that. I think if you talk to many Americans today, and if you even look at members of Congress, you have a low percentage of them that have served in the U.S. military. So if there's no draft and we're relying on an all-volunteer force, that's in some ways good, because you could say, oh, people are choosing to fight, and if you don't want to fight in the Army, you don't have to. But the fact of the matter is you see immense class differences in the representation in the armed forces, and this kind of disconnect between the act of fighting war and the sacrifice it entails and the direct involvement of the American people. So I
this
think
is-
contractors really allow that.
So
to
this is
happen.
like President Eisenhower's farewell address where he warned us of the military-industrial complex. And this is like on steroids. When I was in the Army fed itself. And
Yeah.
now they outsource the feeding of the soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq. And what else do these private contractors do short of, getting into the F-16s and firing missiles? I mean, it keeps getting deeper and deeper into military activities, doesn't it?
Absolutely. They're doing things that used to be wholly governmental activities, everything from interrogating prisoners to pulling the trigger on drones to all sorts of what was formerly seen as governmental functions. So it's not just logistics and providing food for our troops. It's a whole range of functions we used to think should have just been the military's prerogative.
Private corporations actually recruit high security clearance employees for the Pentagon. They actually interview them and recruit the people who are going to work in government with one hand. On the other hand, these companies actually have other Pentagon contracts.
Yes, you really have a situation where government is very much dependent on the private sector to do its daily work. And that's happened for a number of reasons. A big one is this aversion to big government. Where everybody's worried, we think government's inefficient, it's bureaucratic. If you can get markets to work their magic, you want them to do that. But the problem there is that it's kind of an illusion because our government today it's never been bigger than it has been previously in terms of the amount of money it spends. But it's also never been smaller in terms of the number of people it employs to actually oversee that spending. So one statistic I really like is if you look at the number of federal employees in 1966 and you compare it to the number of federal employees on the government payroll today, what you can see is it's roughly the same number. The number is exactly the same. Yet the budget in that same period of time has more than tripled in real terms. And I think that kind of shows you this big gap that's filled by contractors.
Well, a lot of the politicians like this because it can show they're holding down the number of government employees, but they don't mention how many corporate employees are under contract by these agencies, which swell the number enormously. All right, first argument made for outsourcing government with these contractors. And we're talking about Boeing, we're talking about Lockheed Martin, we're talking about Raytheon, and we're talking about hundreds of smaller companies around the Beltway here in Washington. They're often called the Beltway Bandits, which I think is really more than a metaphor.
Yeah.
The first argument they make is that it's more efficient, that you save the taxpayer. That isn't what I've found out. It's far more expensive to feed the soldiers by private contractors in Iraq than it was if the Army fed themselves. So when you make that argument, that rebuttal, they come back and say, oh, but the government doesn't have the technical expertise to do these jobs. That's why they have to contract them out. Would you comment on both of those, technical expertise and efficiency?
Well, here I think it's really important to make distinctions between different types of contracting. It may well be the case that in some instances it does save money, but when you're doing inherently governmental functions, it probably doesn't. Take armed security contractors, for example. There are a lot of studies that show that it potentially costs more to use private security contractors in war zones rather than your own uniformed personnel. And no studies that demonstrate conclusively the cost savings that everybody assumes. So it's really important to look at the numbers and not just start with the assumption that outsourcing is always more efficient. It's going to depend on the sort of thing being outsourced, and it's also going to depend on the structure of the market in which contracts are bid upon and so forth. So for free market principles to prevail, for example, you need a genuinely free market. Yet for many of these functions, what you see are a couple of big firms getting the contract, and there isn't free and fair competition. If that free and fair competition doesn't exist, you can't make the argument that you're going to get the efficiency that free markets are supposed to produce. So that was the efficiency point. And there was another point you had I didn't touch on.
That they don't have the technical personnel. Let's say they need very skilled software experts.
Yeah, this is a huge problem for the future, and I think it's where you're going to see a lot of conflict and debate, because so much of what touches on cybersecurity and its needs is highly technical, and a lot of that expertise resides outside of government. So if you have to rely on the private sector to help you do those functions, it raises a huge problem for oversight, because you can't oversee something for which you don't have the expertise. So some people have said the government has outsourced its brains. through this slow, steady process over time, which, by the way, is a wholly bipartisan process. Democrats and Republicans alike have participated in this march toward privatizing all things possible.
That's why it's never an issue in presidential campaigns and senatorial campaigns. They don't talk about it.
That's right. There's complete agreement.
They think the public's bored by it. Once I was at a big conference of military contractors and government officials. That was in the period of acquisition reform,
yes.
It was called, maybe 15, 20 years ago. And there was one episode that I never forget, and that is that in the question period, when the Pentagon officials had made their presentations and there was a question period, a man stood up for a major contractor and he said, "Do I understand you right? Are you basically letting us develop the criteria by which our weapons will be tested under your contract?"
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And they said, yeah. And in the audience, a fellow turned to me. He was one of the managers of these Pentagon contractors in the Pentagon. Mm-hmm. And he said to me, "What's there left for us to do?" I mean, that's how far it's gotten. And of course, these companies have enormous access to government secrets. Mm-hmm. And here they are, they're supposed to be private corporations, investors, top priority. Is there anything left of an arm's length relationship between these government contractors and the government agencies like USAID, the mm-hmm. Agency for International Development, which you have in your book, or the Pentagon? And in that context, let me ask you this. Senator Obama, when he was a senator, mm-hmm. teamed up with a Republican senator to propose a bill, this was 2007, to put the full text of all government contracts online mm-hmm. above a certain amount in terms of dollars. Do you think this will do the following? Increase the media coverage of these contracts, increase the engagement of taxpayer-sensitive groups, increase the scholarship in the academy to do more research on these contracts, and change the situation at all? You think that's an important reform, which, by the way, has not yet gotten through Congress, even though it has conservative and liberal support? Somehow they don't make it their top priority because the corporate lobbies don't want it.
Well, it seems to me that more transparency in the area of contracts is a good thing, and we've been fortunate with usaspending.gov that great advances have been made. In my book, I rely extensively on data from that source to mm-hmm. track the privatization of American power. And consistently over time, that website has become more and more user-friendly and more transparent. For a while, they were supposed to have subcontracts online. That was completely opaque. They are now online and you can access them. So what you're talking about with the full contract disclosure, that would seem to be a natural next step. The pushback, of course, will be that this is proprietary information.
Right.
But the reason summaries are there, the firms will say, is because it's disadvantageous for that information to be out there where their competitors can read it.
Right now, as you point out, there are summaries of contracts.
That's
and
right.
How much the contract is and what it's for. The full text is what the corporations really don't want.
Yes.
They don't want the full text because it shows, among other things, how one-sided these contracts are.
Yes.
You would think that the government would have the one-sided advantage, but actually the contracts are very heavily written and then accepted by the corporate lawyers representing them. Yeah. How about the issue of competition? In your book, you refer to no-bid contracts. Mm-hmm. Are these contracts bid competitively, or is the military industry so concentrated now with maybe 4 prime contractors like Lockheed Martin that is there a competitor against General Dynamics to build nuclear subs? No. So how about the no-bid contract?
Well, no-bid contracts, are a great example of a market that's not genuinely free and fair with competition, which takes us back to the efficiency debate we were having earlier. If you're going to assume that markets are going to produce more efficient outcomes and save money, the markets have to be free and fair. By definition, a market in which you allow no-bid contracts isn't free and fair. The argument on the other side would be, this is something that we absolutely have to have tomorrow, and we need to get it, and this is a way to get it. And in wartime, those sorts of arguments fly. So that's where you primarily see the no-bid contracts are in wartime contracting. Our problem is that we are fighting wars that are, in a sense, almost perpetual. They don't have beginning and end points. That's the new nature of warfare we're in.
And they're on the government credit card, the taxpayer credit card.
Right, and they're funded through supplemental appropriations, kind of emergency measures. So we're in a permanent state of emergency, and that's very damaging if you're trying to contain costs.
So
and
they're
look out
inadequate
for-
congressional hearings, right, on the supplemental.
Right, well, if the nation's at war,
Yeah.
it's pretty easy for Congress to say, we need this money. American men and women in uniform, their lives are in danger.
So these big budgets for the Iraq War and Afghanistan War, they just hit the floor of the House and Senate. They don't go through the rigorous appropriation hearing process.
Right, when you have supplemental appropriations, it's kind of an emergency allocation, and it doesn't have the same built-in controls and mechanisms for overseeing the spending. One of the reasons why you see such extensive waste, fraud, and abuse with wartime contracting. You also mentioned something earlier that I wanted to touch upon, which is what I call in my book laissez-faire outsourcing. And that's a big problem. That's something we could easily address. The laissez-faire outsourcing occurs when government outsources not just the work itself, but the oversight of that work. And that's obviously problematic because there's a conflict of interest. So one easy step to take would be to ensure that that doesn't take place. And I think there have been some cases like the Deepwater case with the Coast Guard where some real lessons have been learned from huge projects that completely don't deliver the results they were supposed to, with enormous cost overruns. And then you see
What do you
the Coast
see
Guard
of
learning from
the
that.
Government Accountability Office, the GAO, which is the investigative arm of Congress into budgetary issues? Every year they announce that the Pentagon budget is unauditable because the Pentagon doesn't bring the accounting data so that the accountants at the Government Accountability Office can make it auditable. This is
Right.
the biggest budget in the country. It's arguably $700-800 billion when you total it up every year, and it's unauditable. How does that relate with the thesis of your book? Obviously, do these contractors worry about unaudited defense budgets?
You know, that's really a problem for our country and how we're spending taxpayer money. I think what complicates the whole auditing process is the fact that much of the spending is supplemental appropriations, for which there are looser accounting standards for reviewing how that money is spent and whether it actually does what it's supposed to do.
What would you like the GAO to do on the contracts issue that it isn't doing? Because it has 5,000 accountants and investigators.
Well, the GAO has been very good, actually, at highlighting some of these problems.
Yeah.
I rely a lot on their reports and work in my book.
Yeah.
The problem is that it falls on deaf ears. And part of the reason it falls on deaf ears, I guess it would be twofold. One, it's a war, and when America's at war, we want to win. We want to keep our men and women in uniform safe. That's one reason. Another one is, I think, what I would call a kind of free market fundamentalism that's been taken as gospel truth in this country, which assumes that markets will always deliver in the people's interest, that if you just let free and fair markets do their work, the meritorious will rise, and you will get a better situation for all. And the flawed assumption in all of that, of course, is that just letting all these individual people pursue their self-interest is going to produce something that's in the common good.
Well, you have a section on Katrina. Why don't you explain the post-Katrina contracting in context of what you just said? By the way, we're talking with Professor Allison Stanger, who has written this marvelous book, One Nation Under Contract, The Outsourcing of American Power and the Future of Foreign Policy. It was published by Yale University Press. That ought to make you happy, Steve. He's
Oh,
a
yes.
Yale graduate.
Yes. Excellent.
And
They have very good printing
surprising,
facilities there at Yale.
surprising to me, she's also on the Council of Foreign Relations. So we'll get to that in a minute.
I don't mean to brag, Ralph, but
Yeah.
I got rejected from Middlebury College.
Oh, you did?
Yeah,
I'm
just-
sorry about that. That was a loss,
No,
clearly.
I'm bragging.
Okay, so a few words on the post-Katrina hurricane disaster.
Well, it's documented clearly in my book that you had almost private contractors getting there first to get the job done, and that's because the Department of Homeland Security was a brand new creation. Interestingly enough, created by a Republican president who was absolutely against big government. It created a whole brand new government bureaucracy to deal with Homeland Security. So when Hurricane Katrina hit, it was a new entity. It had not long been operating as a whole, and there was a complete failure of response. And some people would say it was fortunate that private contractors stepped in to fill the void. But the question really was, who was leading here, the government or private industry, and making money on it?
Well, a
The
little
number of
vignette on that, Professor Stanger.
Yeah.
I learned that there are 10,000 trailers that were unaccounted for in the sense that they were all in one place in Hope, Arkansas, which is the birthplace of
President Clinton.
President Clinton. And this went on month after month after month. You couldn't even get an aerial picture of it because you'd have to get up too high and you could hardly see that they were what they were. So I wrote President Clinton in New York and I said, can't you do something? Look what they're planting in your hometown. There are homeless people that need these homes and yet they're not being distributed. And he confessed that he tried, but he couldn't get anywhere. That's how bad it is. And then they became exposed to the weather. They became wet, formaldehyde problems, and you're talking millions and millions of dollars of waste. Is that a contract problem?
I'm not familiar with that particular case, so you would have to tell me.
Yeah.
I think the point to realize about the Department of Homeland Security is that there have been, congressional hearings in which people such as Senator Joseph Lieberman have pointed out that the number of contract employees at the Department of Homeland Security exceeds the number of federal employees. There are more contractors working for Homeland Security than actual federal employees, which raises the question of who is really in charge of Homeland Security, our government or private industry.
Yes, this is the bigger point in your book, the corporatization of government. But getting back to Hope, Arkansas, this is where I want to raise the question. As you know, taxpayers don't have standing to sue about, say, government corruption, waste. The courts say, you don't have enough of a stake, we're not even going to let you in the courtroom. And they throw out taxpayer lawsuits. You see a situation in Hope, Arkansas, where you have visibly a failure. There's a failure somewhere because the government contracted for these mobile homes.
What year was this?
This was right after Katrina.
Okay.
It's probably 2006 or so.
Yep.
So the government contracts. The contractor sells 10,000 of these vehicles. Obviously, the government says, well, park them here until we can distribute them to the homeless around the Gulf area. And then nothing happens. Month after month after month. Eventually, I think they sold them for essentially scrap because they were so exposed to the elements and not taken care of, and they had formaldehyde problems. So if the taxpayer has no standing to sue, and the Congress doesn't care much about a situation like this, what would you suggest be done, if anything? You favor taxpayer lawsuits in this contract situation?
I am not a lawyer, so I can't really comment on, what the realm of the possible is in filing lawsuits.
But you're a taxpayer.
I'm a taxpayer.
Okay, would you like to sue if it was pro bono lawyer?
The story of waste, fraud, and abuse in contracting is so extraordinary that it would seem that there need to be some sort of citizen response to insist that our money be managed better.
See, what I'm pointing out is there's a kind of bubble, isn't there? It's the government agency, the contractors, who often hire the government employees when they retire. That's the so-called merry-go-round. And if the Congress doesn't care because the contractors are greasing the wheels in Congress, and the media is not that into the weeds here. They don't really make this a beat, the government contract beat. When there's a big flare-up, then they'll write about the scandal, like Blackwater, et cetera. So it's in a bubble, and it's very hard to see how to break it. Campaign finance reform might help, but if you freeze the 200 million taxpayers out, it seems to me we've got to focus on some sort of challenge from the people that can take these abuses and wasteful contracts into the courts and hold somebody accountable, if not the contractors, the government agency.
Yeah, well, the example you're giving there really shows the absence of kind of government oversight to actually see that the money was spent was executed properly. It was an emergency situation, so someone might respond, we did the best we could in an emergency, but the fact that these trailers just sat there and rotted speaks very poorly. So do we need more citizen involvement in these issues? Yes. I'm not so sure that I agree with you that there isn't coverage of this in the media. I think there's extensive coverage in places like the New York Times and so forth, but it falls on deaf ears. And it's a system that's, in a sense, self-perpetuating. It's not going to reform itself from within because it's serving powerful interests. So the only way you will get pressure for reform is for citizens to somehow organize and challenge things seem to be inappropriate.
In that regard, we have a website for many years called privatizationwatch.org. If listeners want to access it, privatizationwatch.org. We're talking big money here. We're talking contracts across the board. I want to ask you about Agency for International Development, which you have a section in your book on. About 85% of NASA, the space agency's budget, is outsourced. It's contracted out. So privatizationwatch.org gives you a real panorama, at the least, as a listener to this program. You can write your senator and representative and ask for them to get a copy of a contract that you want. And we're talking about $500 billion a year, with a B, of U.S. federal contracts every year going to these companies.
Yeah, another thing listeners can do is simply go to usspending.gov, usaspending.gov, and you can actually track how your taxpayer money is spent in both contracts and subcontracts.
What's your experience, Professor, with people using the Freedom of Information Act to get full copies? Our experience is it's sort of a mixed experience. Once in a while, they'll send you the full copy. Sometimes it's redacted for proprietary or national security. Other times, they'll delay you and, wear you down. Have you tried, and I'm asking this because I think there should be an archive at some university, a library where these government contracts are available online, or people, getting them on paper in the old-fashioned way.
Yeah.
And have you had any experience in that with the Freedom of Information Act request? Say, I want this Grumman, I want this Boeing contract, might be 600 pages. I want the whole thing.
I have not done that because I was largely focused on the macro trends rather than the micro trends. With the available information, you can really track this steady privatization and growth of contracts over time across a range of government agencies. My book was just about the national security realm, but it's obviously a government-wide problem. So having individual contracts, I think, would be revealing, but I almost think we have the information we need to see that the character of our government has changed, and the line between business and government has been blurred in all sorts of ways that are potentially damaging to our democracy.
Oh, yeah, we have far more information than we're using.
Yes.
That's what you're saying.
So more information is the problem. We have the information we need. We need to decide what we need to do about it.
But sometimes if you get into the weeds of these contracts, you can generate some anger out there where you couldn't with a macro approach, saying there's a takeover. You remember that the Pentagon people tell me that no issue got more anger from the people than the $450 claw hammer episode.
And where the toilet seats, the toilet seats, right? That was
like an $8, $10 hammer, somehow through the subcontracting spiral to the prime contractor, it charged the taxpayer $450.
Yeah.
And I think the phrase for the claw hammer, they didn't call it a claw hammer because it's pretty embarrassing, right? I think it was called something like a unilateral impact generator, something like that.
Well, let's also be fair. Those were excellent toilet seats, too.
They were.
Yeah, you remember those?
Yeah.
They were toilet seat covers, Steve.
Oh, but fantastic.
I thought they were toilet seats, but
the
covers.
So let's have you talk a little bit before we conclude on the Agency for International Development in your book.
Well, absolutely. I think that's an interesting chapter in my book because you see the U.S. Agency for International Development basically becoming a contract clearinghouse where the overwhelming majority of its budget is going out the door in contracts and grants, but it's got a very limited staff on the ground to oversee them. And the reconstruction process in Iraq and Afghanistan is problematic for that reason. I think there has since been an effort to, in a sense, build up a policy planning staff in-house at USAID that has hopefully put things on a better path. But at the height of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, you just had money flying out the door for good purposes, really in an effort to respond to needs on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan. But for all sorts of reasons involving the security situation and the chain of subcontracts, you did not get the results that taxpayers would want to see. And I think that's just a larger point about wartime contracting.
Yeah.
This is not a good investment of money. I mean, if you want to invest in infrastructure in a war zone, you're going to create a lot of unintended consequences for that country. You're going to have a jobs creation program, but it's not going to be for Americans. And the likelihood of success is low. Contrast that if you would invest in infrastructure here at home, you might have a very different outcome and you would provide jobs for Americans. So this is not a good use of taxpayer money. And I think people have learned that lesson, or I'm hopeful that they have.
The polls, you ask people, how much are we spending the federal budget on foreign aid? It comes to like 15% when it's actually less than 2%. Right?
That's right. So we're not talking about enormous amounts of money in this realm.
Well, Professor Stanger, could I ask, is there any progress being made in this area? Are you testifying before Congress? Is Congress listening? What is the outlook?
I have testified before Congress multiple times, and there are definitely sympathetic ears in Congress. I think the thing that they would like to see is to show how reform on this issue would actually save taxpayers money. That if you would make significant reform in this realm, it would deliver that to the American people. And that's very hard to do, particularly given that a lot of the contracting is for wartime expenditures, which are seen as an emergency sort of situation. I think there are sympathetic ears in Congress. The problem is that this is a system that is in some sense self-perpetuating because there's a natural career trajectory. You have served a good career in government. Your kid's about to go into college. You need to pay their tuition. You can make the jump to the private sector and suddenly have that money for tuition you wouldn't have had before when you were a public servant. And so that's a very powerful dynamic that, in a sense, keeps the system going because the people involved in it, it serves their interest.
That's why I really emphasize the need for Congress to pass a law requiring the full text of all these contracts. Because just imagine the law schools digging into this. Just imagine law school seminars, law school professors digging into this, not to mention the rest of the university and college world. Think of the press that will come out. Think of the one-sided taking advantage of taxpayers in the fine print. You're on the Council for Foreign Relations. They're not without influence. Have you tried to get them to take some sort of position? Or, they do put out statements and reports. Are they interested in this at all?
Yes, they're definitely interested in this. I've spoken at the Council on Foreign Relations on several occasions, but the problem is that it's just such a large-scale problem because the character of our government has really changed. As that line between business and government has been blurred, and you see this revolving door between business and government, where now there was a recent study that showed that 3 out of 4 lobbyists for the fossil fuels industry are former government employees. So you see this natural symbiotic system, and it's not something that can be changed through a simple reform, but it's something that requires a change in our own thinking about what we value and the realization that business exists for a certain reason. I love this country. It's a great example of an experiment that has worked beautifully and is in some sense an example to the world. But yet, business exists to make money. Their bottom line is different. Government ostensibly exists to uphold the common good. And so if you forget that there's a difference between those two competing interests, you are not going to have a sustainable situation.
Yeah, that's why I think the left-right alliance in Congress has got to be tighter and even staffed.
Well, this is not a partisan issue. This is an American issue.
Yes.
We value the American exception and what it has been, how it's been different from other countries. I think in many ways when you look at corruption, contracting, these are familiar stories. They're present in all countries around the world. But we like to think of ourselves as something that's different. We like to think of ourselves as something that's a relentless project in self-improvement, the pursuit of a more perfect union. So to just look at the current situation and say, this is business as usual, it's unchangeable, is in a sense giving up on something that's quintessentially American, and I would hate to see us do that.
My hope is to weave a very tight alliance in Congress, because for better or for worse, Congress got to play a major role here.
Yeah, it's important to realize, and I really mean to emphasize this, that this is not the result of some evil conspiracy. This is a bunch of people with good intentions pursuing their interests in a system that is kind of derailing the common good or giving up on the common good is something that you would pursue directly. We have to recapture our sense of those things that only government does well.
It doesn't have to be a conspiracy. Greed will carry it. Sheer corporate greed.
Well, but that's the thing. That's supposed to, when you look at the development of liberal capitalism and democracy, they tended to go hand in hand.
Yeah.
So this idea that free markets serve the cause of freedom is something that has some real resonance in the history of European political development, for example.
Yeah.
But what's happened, I think, is that when you have an advanced industrial economy, you have a well-established democracy, these two forces that worked in tandem now seem to be in competition.
Yeah.
And we need to realize that that's what's happening
Yeah.
and make adjustments accordingly
Yeah.
to preserve the things we value.
The book is One Nation Under Contract by Professor Allison Stanger at Middlebury College. It's out in paperback. Get a hold of it, read it, and have fun with your senators and representatives. Just send them a letter, say, I saw this contract reported on the paper and I'd like a full copy of it. I think that will tend to get their attention. At least that's a low entry initiative that people can take advantage of and get the ball rolling.
Absolutely.
So we can make this an issue in political campaigns.
Yeah, well, governments, self-government requires that the American people can see what their government is doing. And what you have to realize about the privatization of government is that renders much of what government does wholly opaque because it's proprietary information. It's contained in these contracts that we don't have access to. So anything that can increase transparency to allow voters to be able to see what their government is doing is potentially a positive development.
Good. Thank you very much, Professor Stanger, for coming. And if anybody wants to get in touch with you, do you want to give them a contact?
It's all on the web. I'm at Middlebury College.
Okay, and what's the website?
Yes, the email is stanger@middlebury.edu.
There you are. Say it again.
stanger@middlebury.edu.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We've been talking to Professor Allison Stanger, who is Professor of International Politics and Economics at Middlebury College. She wrote One Nation Under Contract, The Outsourcing of American Power and the Future of Foreign Policy, which is published by Yale University Press. You're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. We'll be back after this.
Stand up. Oh, step up. Rise up.
From Pacifica, you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Oh, step up. Rise up.
Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Skrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. Gentlemen, apparently there are auto insurance companies out there who may be trying to rip people off. Frankly, I'm shocked. So joining us on the line is J. Robert Hunter. He is the Consumer Federation of America's Director of Insurance. Welcome, Mr. Hunter.
Hi, how are you doing?
Very good. Ralph, take it away.
Yes. Welcome, Robert Hunter. He also was the Federal Insurance Commissioner under Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, and later the Texas Insurance Commissioner. He's a giant figure of consumer-oriented insurance reform, and he's a property casualty actuary. A few weeks ago, I learned a new phrase. It was called price optimization, and it came out of the insurance industry. In this case, a homeowner's insurance company, and I wanted to know what could that have meant, because they're supposed to be regulated based on actuarial standards and cost data, et cetera. So I called Bob Hunter up and I said, Bob, what is this thing called price optimization? And so let's start with that, Bob. Can you explain what it is and who gets the brunt of it? And this will shock our listeners when he tells you who gets the brunt of price optimization.
Price optimization is also known by economists as elasticity of demand. It's a measure that can be used to determine how people shop, and it's used for selling airline tickets and all sorts of things. It's finally migrated into insurance under the name price optimization, where the insurance companies, instead of making prices as they always have, at least they've tried to, based upon the cost of the insurance, the risk of the driver or the home, et cetera, how much would that cost next year, and set a price that cover their costs, their losses, and their expenses, plus a profit. And that was so-called cost-based or risk-based pricing. That was historically has always been what they've done. But now they've added this elasticity of demand factor, and that is by individual policyholder. They determine how you shop. They count how many apples you buy. They count how many beers you buy. They count all kinds of stuff. How expensive is your home, et cetera. They put it into these models, and they come out with a factor that measures how you shop. And if you're not a shopper, your price will go up. The less you shop, the more your price will go up. So the most loyal customers are the ones who are most at risk here.
In other words, if you're frugal, you pay for it in other ways.
Yeah, if you stay on with your company and you think, well, this is a good company and I'd be a good customer and just stay with them year after year, you're at very high risk of being price optimized.
So I know homeowners who just got a notice in the mail, you're going up 35% on your premium for your homeowner's insurance. And homeowners say, what? I've been with this company for 25, 30 years. I've never made a claim. Why are my rates going up? And the answer is what, Bob?
Well, it's likely in that scenario that the person has been price optimized. That is that because they never shop, never leave the company, because they're loyal customers, the company is now going to take advantage of that situation and raise the price above what the fair price is based upon cost.
And they have enough data information about the personal consumer behavior of their customer to figure out that these homeowners won't rebel and say, the hell with you, I've been loyal for 25 years, I'm shopping elsewhere.
Yeah, they have enough data for that. It's amazing. We have a copy of a rate filing Allstate made in Wisconsin, which has about 200,000 classifications in Wisconsin for its 25 or 30,000 customers. So obviously, and the goal of these price optimizers is to put every policyholder, every person into their own slot. And they measure then all your shopping behavior, they get this data from, probably from the various food stores, they get this data from credit score companies, they get this data from knowing where your house is and looking at the value of your house, and a whole raft, hundreds and hundreds of items are used to determine if you're going to leave. And they figure out exactly how much they can raise different people's prices above fair prices, and they will stay, and they take advantage of that. Now, obviously, they make mistakes sometimes. Somebody leaves. Somebody hears about it. Hopefully, your listeners, if they've had a recent price increase and they've been loyal customers, will shop around next time they come up for renewal.
Now, you mean to say, you just said something that was astounding. I've got to elaborate it for our listeners, that Allstate had far more categories, you call them classifications, far more classifications for different pricing mechanisms than the number of customers they have in Wisconsin?
Yes. In fact, they wrote a letter, they were asked a question about it in Pennsylvania, which Pennsylvania turned down their filing. And one of the questions Pennsylvania asked that led to the turn down was, how many classifications do you have here? And you've sent 2,500 pages of just the lists of the classes, which were like 75 per page. And so it's around 200,000 here in Pennsylvania, and they said, well, that's only part of it. If we sent you all of it, it would be 200 million, and we'd have to send you 2 million more pages in the filing.
This is like out of science fiction.
Yeah, and they have data for all those people that are out there in the country on how they shop. It's big data run amok.
Yeah. Before I ask you how consumers can fight back on this, tell me the last time the property casualty insurance industry lost money, and tell me what is the state of profits in recent years for this industry.
They've never really lost money except in a very odd year like Hurricane Andrew or something like that. But they may lose money on underwriting, but they make it up on the investment float that they earn. And so, they've been making very healthy profits for generations.
Now tell me, what can consumers do? You've been a very safe driver. You've been a very conservative homeowner. You haven't made claims. You're loyal. You pay your premiums on time to your company. Suddenly you get these enormous increases. What can consumers do?
Well, the most important thing, and I've talked to several consumers who have done this, is shop. And then some will shop and then go back to their original company. One had a $700 6-month premium from their auto insurer. That was a very large rate increase, so they went and shopped and found someone willing to sell it to them for $500. They went back to the company and said, I'm not going to pay you a $700 fee. And they said, well, let us think about it, and they came back with $450. And so shopping and letting the company know you're shopping is probably the best thing you can do. But you should also tell your insurance commissioner that this is bad. We've had some success. We've been writing all the insurance commissioners and pointing out these issues. These actions are illegal in every state because they're charging different people with the same risk a different price. And that's a classic definition of unfair discrimination. And 3 states so far have banned it: Maryland, Ohio, and California. And New York just last Friday issued a letter to all the insurance commissioners saying, let us know within, I think it's 30 days, exactly what you're doing, because we think it's illegal and we want to ban it, but we want to see what you're doing first.
You mean insurance companies?
They told the insurance companies, to advise them what they're doing, and then they probably going to ban it in New York, too, when they get the answers. So we've got 4 states so far, and that kind of action is unusual, but it's so incredibly outrageous that even the insurance commissioners are acting.
Well, that's what Bob Hunter does. He talks to the National Insurance Commissioners Organization. They met in Washington a few weeks ago, and he went and made this presentation. So the way to solve this price optimization situation is to say it's illegal under existing insurance regulation in state.
Yeah, we don't need new laws. We don't need new laws. We got the laws.
It's to declare it illegal. It's to get the insurance commissioners to say to the insurance companies, you cannot jack people's prices up based on a price optimization formula. Therefore, stop it. And I think consumers, as you say, can write or call their insurance commissioner and say, why aren't you stopping it? There are 3 or 4 states, Maryland, Ohio, California, that have already done it. And that's the best argument you can make if you're in a state where the insurance commissioner hasn't yet stopped it. And they all know about it now, in part because of Bob Hunter and his constant presentations before the National Insurance Commissioners.
Yeah, and we've sent probably 6 or 7 letters to all the insurance commissioners, too, so they have no excuse. They know it, and we've documented it, and it's illegal, and they should act. But also, in the meantime, if they haven't acted, you should start shopping yourself. It's always a good idea to shop for insurance anyway, because the price differentials between companies is amazing because of the weak competition.
Bob, before we conclude, give our listeners all your contact numbers, because if they want to know more, they want to get copies of your letters, of your arguments, where do they go?
Well, first of all, our letters and some releases are on the Consumer Federation website at consumerfed.org, consumerfed.org, and click on Financial Services under Issues, and then you'll see Auto Insurance, and click on that. Most of those letters are under the Auto Insurance tab. So you can find those letters, which you can see go to all the insurance commissioners in some specific states. That's one place to get information. The other is to just call me or write me. You could write me. You could call me at 703-528-0062, 703-528-0062, or you could write me at 2202 North 24th Street, Arlington, Virginia, 22207.
I've been sitting here. I think I've come up with a slogan for people. If you've been price optimized, you've been PO'd. So you can say, hey, I've been PO'd, and I'm PO'd about it.
Exactly.
They're very good, Steve. Yeah, they're very good, Steve.
Thank you.
Actually, I got to be honest.
What I tried to do is kind of come up with a pithy thing that would stay in people's minds and get them to act.
I got to be honest with you. That was so bad, I thought I came up with it. I'm thinking, am I saying that? My lips aren't moving. That's pretty...
By the way, you've just listened to a giant of insurance reform on behalf of you, the consumer. And when he gives you those contact numbers, take advantage of it. Thank you very much, Bob.
You're welcome, Ralph. Nice talking to you.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
J. Robert Hunter is the Director of Insurance for the Consumer Federation of America. You've been listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. We'll be back after this.
Stand up. Oh, stand up. Rise up.
From Pacifica, you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, nader.org. If you would like Ralph Nader's weekly column in your inbox, just subscribe over at nader.org. And you also need to like Ralph's Facebook page, because if you like it, if you hit the like button, then you can ask Ralph questions, and we will try to read your questions on the air. For example, this question comes from John Ralston. He says, Ralph, I'm curious. He asks if so-called free trade deals inhibit governments from using antitrust laws to break up big companies.
On paper, the answer is no. The antitrust laws in the various countries are supposed to be still operational, even if we have NAFTA, the World Trade Organization, or the notorious forthcoming Trans-Pacific trade deal that Mr. Obama is going to send to the U.S. Congress, which I hope will reject it. That doesn't mean that the clever corporate trade lawyers cannot figure a way where if our country, for example, imposes a regulatory action against companies, that they can't come in with a theory saying that they can't do that. But on paper, the answer is antitrust laws survive and are operational under these trade agreements. What isn't surviving is the extension of the patent monopolies, which by definition are exempted from the trade agreements, and they're given even more protection on the part of drug companies, for example, under the proposed Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement than ever before.
Hasn't the EU in the past 2 years been pretty good about enforcing antitrust when it comes to Google?
Yes, the Federal Trade Commission in our country rejected a staff report saying that the Federal Trade Commission should take action under the antitrust laws against Google, but Google didn't get away with it in the European Union. In recent years, the European Union has been more active in enforcing the antitrust laws, which originated in the United States back in the 1890s, than the U.S. government has been.
We have another question from Jane Taylor Hall. She says, Ralph, any news on the GettingSteamed.org pledge campaign? I guess, first of all, you should probably explain what Getting Steamed pledge campaign is.
I want to thank Jane Taylor Hall for asking, because this is unfortunately unfinished business on our part. I put out a book in 2009 called Getting Steamed, and it was full of summaries of corporate crimes, abuses, and outrages that came from the investigative reporting of the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Corporate Crime Reporter, and other established publications. And so there were dozens and dozens of these examples, some of them taking no more than one page, on how people are dying because of dangerous pharmaceuticals, how they're getting ripped off in their home mortgage, all the things in person's daily livelihood where they're getting abused, exposed to risks of health and safety, as well as eroding their family budget. And at the end, I says, here's what we can do about it. If we can get 1 million people to dedicate 100 hours volunteer a year, spread out in congressional districts, and donate $100 each, whether they donate or raise, we would have enough power to turn Congress around and make corporate crime law enforcement and corporate crime prevention hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of lives saved, a reality. Unfortunately, the book Getting Steamed was published by a very small publisher that couldn't promote it, and it didn't get much attention. So I did get a few dozen people saying, okay, I'm on board, sign me up. And there were stages that we'd go to the first 1,000 people, then the 10,000, and then 100,000, and then 1 million. But I want to say to Jane Taylor Hall, I think it's still a very good idea. And we hope sometime during the 50th anniversary year of Unsafe at Any Speed, which starts in November, we will reinstate this effort and give it more publicity. Because when you think of it, 1 million people donating or raising $100 each and contributing 100 volunteer hours lobbying their senators and representatives around an explicit corporate crime reform agenda is a winner. Lock, stock, and barrel. It is a winner.
Justin Kukuruzovich asks, what's Ralph's solution for making the federal debt more manageable?
Well, first of all, the traditional approach is to keep interest rates low so the taxpayer doesn't have to pay high interest on the federal debt. That certainly has been managed. Unfortunately, it's hurt small savers who can't get even 1% on their savings bank or credit union savings accounts. The second is to dramatically reduce corporate welfare disbursements, which in effect involve using taxpayer money to bail out, subsidize, give away handouts to corporations, which right-wingers don't like, and they call it crony capitalism. The third is to decrease the Pentagon's budget, which is full of waste, fraud, and abuse in the contracting area. And we have to roll back empire here. A lot of people are beginning to say, whether it's people who like Ron Paul or people who like progressives, what are we doing with bases in over 100 countries as if we're the policemen of the world, which we certainly seem to be, when everything's boomeranging on us And we're basically throwing gasoline on fire that's spreading all over Asia and Africa in terms of people who are taking up arms against their dictators backed by the U.S. or the U.S. presence in those states. And Iraq is one example, Afghanistan is a number. Once you cut those kind of expenditures, you're making the federal debt more manageable. So those are the ways that I would proceed. Too many of the taxpayer dollars are taken from moderate income people and given to the rich, the corporate rich and the super wealthy, who by getting these tax loopholes and tax breaks are in effect throwing the burden back on tens of millions of moderate taxpayers.
Well, I think we have come to the end of another Ralph Nader Radio. I want to thank John and Jane and Justin. I think we can call them the J-Team for their Facebook questions. Remember, if you have a question, go to Ralph's Facebook page, ask it, and we'll try to read it on the air. We've come to the end of another Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Join us again next week. On behalf of David Feldman and Ralph Nader, I'm Steve Scrovan. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you very much, David and Steve, and thank the listeners. Spread the word. Get more radio stations picking up the program. Together, we can make a difference.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
From Pacifica, you've been listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Special thanks to John Richard, Matthew Marin.
Our graphic designer is Jimmy Lee Wirt. Our editor is Jimmy Lee Wirt. Our board operator is Jimmy Lee Wirt.
Oh, what the hell. Let's make him our producer.
Our producer is Jimmy Lee Wirt.
And thanks to our executive producer, Alan Minsky.
And most importantly, special thanks to Mr. Ralph Nader, www.nader.org.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, is written and performed by Kemp Harris.
If you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour as a podcast and would like to listen to it as a broadcast,
call your local radio station and say, I want the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
He's Steve Scrovan.
I'm Steve Scrovan. He's David Feldman.
Until next time.
Say you're tired of trying. You say we have no choice. Say you're just one person, and who will hear your voice? Don't let them fool you. You have the power in your hand. I'm only trying to school you.